Dear YouTubers, welcome to Eduardo's Aesthetics Instagram channel. I'm Eduardo Aesthetic, and I would like to, in the next few minutes, give you my reasoning behind my name, introduce myself a little bit, and then get into some philosophical discussion. My DMs are open. My comments section is below, and I'll be sharing on multiple platforms. So why call myself Eduardo's Aesthetic, you may ask? Well, I've always had a fascination with philosophy, especially aesthetic philosophy. So to me, aesthetic philosophy encompasses the world as we know it, the universe at large, the objects within it, our minds, and how we perceive things, and the junction of object, universe, and mind. So it's a tripartite system, which, if I'm not mistaken, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy describes it as the following term, in the following terms. Aesthetic has come to be used to designate, among other things, a kind of object, a kind of judgment, an attitude, a kind of experience, and of value. So you can take that from that what you will. And if we extrapolate that into how it, again, prefigures how I deal with myself, on my Instagram, I usually call things aesthetic because I like the look of them, because they make me feel something, because they reveal something of the world. And within that, I learn about myself in the process. The aesthetic world for me is a realm by which, from a tangible sense, from something that you can touch, from something you can smell, you can see, you can hear, you can imagine, you have a perception or better depth of understanding of what's going on in your head. So I've decided to go back into my bookshelf behind me and pick out a book. And this one is the Aesthetics Classical Readings, edited by David E. Cooper, which is part of a Blackwell publishing series. And I, first of all, read parts of this book for a critical aesthetics course at university the first time round. And I was really taken by this course. So I thought I would do a little series in which I speak about the different ways in which contemporary art intersects with aesthetics. And today I wanted to start off with something quite funny in its own weird way. That being the connection that my mind has made between Plato's Republic, the 10th book, and Tracy Emins' Bed, which is currently on at Tate. Not on, but it's owned by Tate Britain, or a variant of it is owned by Tate Britain. As already made, it can be made again and again and again. So what is the Republic? The Republic is a philosophical manuscript by Plato, written 2,000 plus years ago, over 2,000 years ago if I'm not mistaken, and it's one of the foundational texts in Western philosophy. Many people know the political ramifications of such a text, but mostly the philosophical ramifications are never taken into consideration. Um, Through this little review, through this little conversation that I'm going to have with you, I'm going to engage with you. I would like to look at this text in detail, or what I consider to be detailed. And I would like to bring your attention to certain things of interest and make the connection with Tracy Emins' bed and how they're relevant, or how it is still a text that elicits strong emotion from not emotion, but elicits a strong reaction, and can be seen as influential in many different ways. Just going to bring up not Spivak. Tracy Emin's bed is on my iPad, so I'm bringing up Tracy Emin's bed on the iPad. Great. The Republic, or the 10th chapter of the Republic, begins in a very conversational way. So we have an interaction between Glaucon and Plato. Glaucon is the interlocutor, or the other speaker, who usually just ejaculates yes or maybe, or sometimes has a let's just say a confirming part, but he's a reluctant participant in this whole affair, in a similar way as we can imagine Plato feels his audiences. So Glaucon sometimes takes it a part of being a sounding board, but also a check against Plato's mind, and the relationship between both of them is quite an interesting one, and it reminds me a little bit of the Hegelian slave master dialectic. We wonder at this point what sort of relationship of authority these two figures occupy. But here we go. There's a section, or in the first page, or the first section of Homer, not Homer, of Plato's dialogue with Glaucon on aesthetics. The first part of it comes as kind of a little bit of a humble address. So he addresses us directly, or addresses Glaucon, and by implication us, as the mediator, saying he adores Homer, and because of his admiration for Homer, he can speak on Homer. But that's not the only thing that he discusses during this text. He brings into consideration the nature of God and the object, or many objects, and who in essence is, or which in essence is the truest object, who is the, or which iteration of a bed, for example, is the most true to its nature, and thus the most virtuous. So there's a certain amount of value judgment. So we're looking at value in this text, and the value of an object, or of a piece of of an object or of an artifact or of a piece of art. And all of these anthropological, um, we could call them objects or themes, run through the whole text. So, in one section, in the same section that I was just talking about, the person can't see very well. If it doesn't mean that he won't often see things before people with better eyesight than them. So in this case, he's saying, which is quite obvious, even if I'm blind in my analysis, I may still be able to see things that other people don't see. So he's appealing to our sense of something that he has stumbled upon, something that might be quite controversial, even in his day. So he's kind of sacrificing a sacred cow at the altar. And he's really wanting us to understand that he's doing something quite brave in his eyes. And there's continuous allusions to drawing from familiar ideas, which is a direct quotation. So it goes on. There's a position in which Plato, or the speaker, which is, I think the speaker is Plato in this case, talks of how there is a being. First of all, there's a being who has many. No, there's a being who is capable of creating lots of beds and tables. And then he slowly develops that discussion into a being who creates the universe, the tools, everything, and also creates himself. So that's the first thing. And I've written here, the master and the maker who makes everything and even the universe itself. So that's that point. And one of the ways in which things can be made is via mirror. So he argues that, in essence, by mirroring the world or using a mirror, a way of human beings also becoming godly is by presenting ourselves an image or presenting a reflection of what the world is through a directly representational field. And when this happens, you also become a god in essence, because you have an image in your mind, and the mind's image is now being affirmed by another image, which is a direct indirect conversation with you. Because it's made in the mind, because this object is sort of made in your mind, it's thus made real and actual, which is one of the words that he uses. And it's a real thing. And the painter, of course, has a sense, creates a bed also. But it's not a real bed, is what he's trying to lead us on to. This bed is in his mind, is a facsimile of a bed. It's not a real bed because even though it has an aspect of the bed, it's not the original bed created by the originator or the progenitor, who is the person who has the power to create himself, and it is a he in this case, according to Plato, and the world around him. And the questions asked, what makes a particular bed not the type of which is the real bed? And it's this question that goes on being sort of lapidated and taken to extremes in this text, but very stoic extremes. Um, and he says it's not actually the creation of the painter, the bed, but the bed is it isn't real, and in a similar way, it actually, but it is a bed in essence, but it isn't a bed because it isn't a true bed. It's a representation of a bed. And that sort of twist is where he says there is a problem. And he goes on. Well, you've got three beds. The first is the real one, we would say, I imagine, and that is the product of divine craftsmanship. And I mean, who else could that have been made of? And in a sense, there's a bit of doubt in that because all the way through, he's asking who else could have made the bed, who else makes things, and that in itself kind of displays the jocundity of this text. It's quite a jokey text. It's quite a light-hearted text in essence because he makes certain jokes and jabs, but there is in that kind of lightness, that litotes, a more a more deep message, a less surface message and a more deep message. Then there's the one that the joiner makes, which is the bed that a joiner makes. So someone who just who puts wood together, but isn't the sort of person that invented the bed. So there's an inventor, and there's someone who copies a bed, and then there is a painter of the bed, someone who takes the image of a created object, of a designed object, and transposes it not in a realist form, like a reflection, like the real object of the bed, but as something linearly in progress from that bed, but beyond it. And it goes on. Even if he were to make only two such beds, I said an extra one would emerge, and both of the other two beds would be of the one type. And it, and not the right two beds, would be the real bed. This point is quite, I would argue, is a little bit mysterious. Where does this third bed come from? But it's not that mysterious if you think about it in the sense of the mind. He's talking about this. What he's alluding to is that the bed is in essence elusive because it resides in the mind of the maker, someone we don't know, but someone we can be, because we can also be what the maker is, which is someone who knows all and makes all and has knowledge of all, which he contradicts himself a little bit later on. And he says, God realizes this. I'm sure he didn't want to be made a kind of joiner. So he's saying that God doesn't. He makes one bed that is like the best bed you can ever see, and that one bed becomes in essence, the most real bed and the original bed. It has an aura to it, and then everything else that comes from it. There's the joiner, who is a derivative of the first bed, which is one step removed. And the third step removed is the painting. So you need to always think about it in a triadic motion. And he says a painter isn't isn't a maker of beds, because what he's painting, or she's painting, what they are painting, is not a real bed. Most suitable things, the most suitable thing is to call him what would be a representer. So he's saying that painters are usually representers and not designers or godly in what they do, which kind of runs counter to our idea of what a painter is, in the sense that we seem to see them currently as being godly in the way that they have been pushed up into celebrity for creating these objects. Like Tracy Emin's bed is a celebrated object, like it or not. And then he goes on. I tell you, whether you look at a bed from the side of or straight on or whatever, it's still just as much a bed as ever it was, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't actually alter it at all. It appears different, doesn't it? And does the same thing goes for anything else that you can mention, yes? So he's talking about here the fact that if you have a bed, for example, and you have a bedboard and you're looking only at the bedboard, so you're looking at the reduced perspective. He's talking about the perspective. So if you only see the reduced perspective of the bedboard and a shortened bed frame, and then there's the other bedboard at the back, or if you look at it from a side shot and you see the long bed and the mattress itself, the sideboards are only represented by two sticks. Because you have prior knowledge of what a bed looks like, you in essence know what the bed is. You are always conscious of the fact that beyond these mere how can I put it? Beyond these mere parameters of what you can see, there lies a bigger objective bed, which is a crazy point of view, because it's not a crazy point of view, which is an interesting point of view, because on a first reading, you see what you understand. You understand it to be that his point is a moot point. Yes, when you see a bedboard, you know that you see a bed. But at the same time, he's also saying the perspective from which you see that bed modulates your interaction and your idea of that bed. So there's a kind of suspension of disbelief that has to happen there, because you're in essence forced to, on one level, agree with him that the bed is always there despite you having a foreshortened perspective of it. And if I read it again, there's an appearance of difference, but it's all still the same. You have a different perspective on it, but it's still a homogenous perspective, which is a very it's an interesting discovery to make. Okay, then he goes on. The painter might make what might paint a shoemaker, but he doesn't have a clue about shoemaking or joinery. He'll still paint a picture of artisans working at these and all other areas of expertise. So what he's saying there is, what is the end of painting? Because if a painting doesn't really represent reality, because you only see what someone else's idea of what you should be seeing is, because it's a derivative bed again, or it's a derivative shoe, and the person who is painting the shoe does not have any idea about how the object is made, does that make the object in itself pictured less valuable? It's a consideration that we wouldn't usually make. But if you extrapolate that into what can be said about Tracy Emin's bed, which we will do in a bit, it kind of problematizes the whole interaction. It may also elucidate a section of the interplay between the viewer and the object and the artist. So he then names his interlocutor Glaucon. They've met someone who's mastered every craft, and the world's leading expert is absolutely every branch of human knowledge. We should reply they're being rather silly. They seem to have met the kind of illusionist who's expert at representation and thinks to their own ability to evaluate knowledge, ignorance, and the representation, and to have been so roughly taken in as to believe in his omniscience. So basically goes against people who are jack of all trades. People who think that they know everything, but don't know everything, because it's impossible to know everything, because you need to be a person who can design the universe, can design yourself, and then design the tools around you, and then design and build beds that are original beds. And that those beds are in essence created in a vacuum. They must be created in a vacuum, because the creator can create one bed or two beds, but a third one appears from somewhere. I think the third one must be the bed in the mind of the being who has created those beds, those objects to be used. And that's really the crux of what goes on in this discourse. the judgment of the expert, people are fooled into thinking via the act of poetry and the virtue of the existence that they see is real as opposed to being a derivative of fiction, which is me, which is my notes kind of saying even if there's a judgment being made on on a bed, on the value of a bed, because a painter doesn't create his own bed or his or her own bed, they in essence are always derivative and are fictional. But they're not, because you can see the bed. So it's not a fictional bed, it's still a bed, which problematizes his whole argument on appearance. Because we know it's a bed, but it also is a foreshortened bed. So it's not a full bed because it's impossible within the dimensions of artistry in a 2D surface to create a 4D bed. And he goes on later on to say that the bed in itself is, what does he say? The bed in itself is something along the lines of the bed in itself is almost like a, how can I put it? The bed in itself is almost like what? The painted bed is a lie. It elicits the same emotion as the first bed, but because that first bed is a true emotion, and that fake bed elicits the same emotion as the true bed, it, in essence, unlike the other two beds, is not virtuous. It is not a good bed. It suffers from the fact that it misleads us into thinking that it's the original. And that's where it all gets more complicated. If there were an expert in what he claims, if there's an expert in universality and makes more solid things, then in turn for being given a pass to active, from passive to active. So in there, I'm trying to really say, because the bed or the painter is passive, which is where Plato is trying to lead this discussion, which is, I think, a veiled reference to homosexuality or femininity, which he has very interesting views on. He says something along the lines of, later on, that it's the inventive nature of poetry that doesn't cure anything, doesn't, in this case, he's mentioning Homer by face and by name and by number. That doesn't cure anything. That doesn't, in essence, have any followers. Who doesn't, in essence, have any children. How can you take a man seriously like that? Which is what he's saying. He's sending for him. So he also says that Homer is not a doctor of language, he's an approximator of feeling, which Plato problematizes later on to say something along the lines of that feeling which Plato engages with, no, who Homer engages with, is not a true feeling and is a derivative feeling which feminizes men, and it is men that he's talking to. Men are his audience. Sorry, everyone else. Um, which feminizes his audience if you're a man. Because when you're sat down taking in a movie or taking in a play, for example, which is what he's referring to, an epic, a tragedy, or or a long poem, then you suspend disbelief. You get taken in by the words, and this goes against the Stoic nature of Platonism, because he says something along the lines of, to paraphrase grossly, that let me see, that if a man who is seen engaging in poetry in his private life loses his son, and then in public is comforted, or a child that scrapes their knee and is forced to cry because of that knee scrapage is then given, is cultivated, or is given a bandage for which to put on his leg. um, there's a difference. The poetry or the play that is being watched and is depicting that scene elicits a response in the real world, which would mean that there is no balm for which to calm the the crying of a child, or to stop a man from mourning his child, because when you are in public you put on a front. When you're in private, you may you may think about crying, but because in public you put on that front, it makes it more difficult. So he's advocating that the real effect of poetry and painting is that it makes us too sloppy, in essence. It makes the reader, or it makes the participant in the chorus, or it makes us, the viewer, more sloppy. And in so doing, we are in essence feminized and pacified. And that feminization, that pacification, is what makes us lesser. And he goes on. He quotes himself saying that Homer, in essence, again, that whole nature of the shoemaker, Homer, in essence, again, isn't a great man, or shouldn't be taken as a great man, because he's not fought in a war. He gives all sorts of examples of other ways that Homer um, hasn't, in essence, achieved standing, or hasn't, in essence, experienced what he has created. And he thinks only those who have experienced certain things should talk about these certain things. So only those who are universally acknowledged to have gone through war should talk about war, which I think is a bit of a turd of an idea, because we don't exclude, even though I'm being a little bit retroactive in the way that I'm speaking, you don't necessarily exclude people who have different views from you because they may have not suffered from what you've suffered. Obviously, there is an element of you are the expert in your own pain, but another person's perspective sometimes can either enhance or invalidate what is in the mind of the person who is creating or projecting a certain image. For example, you wouldn't necessarily trust a soldier to give you an account of something like the the storming of Basra or something like that, because he in that moment has allegiance to the positive, so the non-passive, the aggressive action that is being taken on those citizens. He in that moment is then being forced to relive and validate why he went and carried out the action. So his bias prejudices whatever he says, is what I'm trying to say. Whereas Plato argues that Homer, for not having experienced any of this, cannot speak on it. In the same way as a painter hasn't built beds, cannot paint beds, because he's not the person who originally went out and procured the wood or designed the wood, or like all of the infinite regress arguments you can imagine come out there. So he's judging Homer on the fact that he hasn't used a knife to kill someone. He hasn't manufactured a bed. He hasn't represented a bed, so he can't talk about the bed in the same amount of authority. Which, if you start unraveling things, becomes very technically insidious, because it means not only is a fictional account therefore lesser, not only is someone who makes one step behind, someone who is a craftsman, not in any way qualified to be a craftsman because he isn't a designer. That designer is the only person who can craft, because they can sketch beds. Drawing that line, they are the only ones who can ever talk about the experience of it all, which is a very high bar to set. He says the following: a pipe player, for example, tells a pipe maker who of his pipes do what they're supposed to do, and then actually played, and goes on to instruct him in what kind of pipes to make, and what the pipe maker does the pipe maker does what he's told. So it's the fact of being told to do something. So the pipe player is one level above the pipe maker in one instance, because the pipe player has played the instrument, so he knows exactly what would make that pipe viable, and hence a person who merely assembles an object has less material, or has less value attached to his craft. He's not a designer progenitor. He's a representer. He's not a representer, which is the elision of terms that Plato uses in order to twist things. So, in order for us to find value, Plato says that we must weigh things, or that the mind has two modes: one lesser mode, which is ununderstandable, and one higher mode, which is the x and the y, which if you understand, the x and the y can be added up together to make xy, which is a formula. So it's a formulaic mind. And the lesser mind is something a little bit more chaotic, that doesn't have a similarly tangible experience. So in terms of a bed, it doesn't exactly provide you with any amazing knowledge of the perspective which you're taking. It obscures. It is only made up of colors, and it is made up of shapes, but it doesn't, in essence, look like a real bed. It doesn't physically look like a real bed, and it isn't a real bed, but it has all the hallmarks of being a bed. So for that, it is a lesser item. Then he ends on a point where he strips everything back and says that poetry can be brought back, in essence, to the world when it's no longer lying, when it no longer emasculates men, when it no longer does all of the stuff that I said that poetry shouldn't do, according to Plato, which is to touch oneself and to change one's view of how or what the world is around us. So, what do I think of that? In essence, I found the argument quite circular in its nature. He deconstructs the whole notion of what a bed is and who is able to claim credit for that bed. And if I use Tracy Emins as example, and I'll also use there's a book on my shelf. Let me see if I can get it. Oh my god, where is it? There's a book on the shelf. Anyway, that talks about laws and norms. And it basically said that the reason why people get upset with people who are not conforming is because they see it as disrespectful of their way of life, of their worldview. And someone who doesn't conform is usually disrespecting norms and in essence also disrespecting the boundaries that these norms set. So when this is taken into account, when we talk about something like Tracy Emins' bed, Tracy Emins' bed harkens back to my Tracy Emins' My Bed harkens back to 20th century ideas inspired by Duchamp and Ready Made, and brings it forward and asks us to also consider in a very subtle way the ideas surrounding ownership. Who owns this bed? She says that she owns it, so she has the right to present it as an object of art. It's a bed, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that she slept in and has done all sorts of things in that bed, and is representational of a whole load of experiences that she's gone through. Her bed has seen a lot of action, basically, is what I'm trying to say. And for people who are not open-minded, this kind of dialogue between the kind of Platonic idea of what art is, art is meant to be beautified reality that does not offend moral sensibilities. Whereas what Tracy Emin and what the modernists are doing is saying, like Duchamp is saying, the bed in itself is not just a conduit for carrying a discussion on about the universality of a maker's craft and who should make and what is considered to be art. But it's also saying that because I say something is something, you have to take it on trust that it is something. Which, if we use the Platonic line of argument, is in itself quite disruptive because it says a bed has to be made by a maker who is capable or knowledgeable of all aspects of bed making and all aspects of the world. You have to be a worldly person who's also divine and being able to create yourself. But that taken down to today's context, Tracy Emin's bed is something that she's produced because of her experience, purely through experience. And that in itself also aligns itself with Plato's idea of what a bed is, or of anyone who's able to speak on what a bed is. And in doing so, she invokes the Spivakian concept of who can speak, who is allowed to speak on behalf of whom. Because as a woman, Tracy Emin is using her bed, the illicit bed, and is forcing us into a conversation about the positionality that we assume in relation to our own beds, what we do in our own beds, what she has done in her own bed, which is also quite subversive because there's a woman taking on her sexuality and practically flaunting it to the general public by displaying the residues, by displaying the detritus of her lived experience. She is affronting what is the sensibilities of that space and time. So, what have we learned today? I've discussed how Tracy Emin's bed relates to Plato, and especially the 10th book of the Republic. In particular, I've discussed how authenticity and who has the right to create work, and who in at an experiential level is able to claim authorial responsibility for a work is still being discussed today. Because you can say that the IKEA bed that Tracy Emin slept in is IKEA's property, and beyond that, the wood that it came from and all the rest of it belongs to God. So there is a continuous regress argument. Who can at what point assume what level of responsibility? And how does that, and when we take things on trust, how does that impact our own ideas of what it is to be human? Because when we take things on trust, we intrude. We intrude on ourselves, and we're not extruding from or not being led out from our place of darkness. Because education means to be led out from darkness. Eduque. Intrudo is the opposite of eduque. And intrude is what happens when you take part in a poetic reading, for example, because you internalize the lived experience of someone else, which is not authentic to you. For example, man can relate to a woman in a similar way in poetry that he would relate to a woman's emotions and and would in essence be relating to the way that she would supposedly be feeling about a man, which is a subversive context in which to encounter that sort of cross-dressing emotion, or that trespassing across homoerotic and sexual lines, which is where I want to say end, to say that this text is problematic because it both brings up interesting points regarding the valency of how or to what extent we can know everything and claim everything to be true, and what at the end is the end result of that claim to knowledge and that claim to understanding, which is usually the idea, moreover, that an artist or a painter or an artisan or God, who has the right to claim the bed for himself? And Tracy Emin has the last laugh on this, because she's saying, I haven't made the bed, I haven't painted the bed, I've only slept in the bed, so I've experienced the bed. Hence why I have chosen the bed, extending that process even further to a Duchampian level. I have taken that bed and I have called it art. That intellectual mind explosion that happens at that point is what literally drives the whole narrative, because it's not enough that you can, in essence, claim ownership of an idea. So he's ownership in this case. It's not enough that Plato can claim ownerships over emotions that he inspires in people and that he's taught people by extension, and has been called the father of Greek poetry, or the father of the Greek nation, Homer. But in itself, that is a flaccid argument, because Homer has no children. Homer has no disciples. Homer has only, in essence, an existence as a vibration, as a living object in the activated sphere of a performance. That in itself is what Tracy Emin does. She performs. She performs emotion, she performs expression. And for that reason, she performs the act of being godly and being a creator. And that was my first impressions of the 10th book of the Republic by Plato in relation to Tracy Emin.